Zara was only 7 years old when they took everything from her. She remembered that morning very clearly, even after many years had passed. And she remembered how the golden light came through the tall windows of the palace, and how her mother stood in the great hall wearing her beautiful crown, and how the council members gathered in a half circle with their long robes touching the marble floor. She did not understand what was happening at first, because she was just a child who liked to play in the royal gardens and chase the little flying creatures that glowed in the dark, and she thought maybe this was some kind of ceremony or celebration. But then she saw her mother crying, and she knew something was very wrong. The high priest stepped forward, and his voice echoed through the hall like thunder, and he said words that Zara did not fully understand at that age, but she understood the feeling behind them, and the feeling was cold and sharp, like a knife made of ice. He said that Zara was cursed, and that her silver blood was a sign of disaster, and that she would bring ruin to the entire kingdom of Valorath if she stayed. And he said that the ancient texts were clear about this, and there was no other choice but to send her away forever. Zara looked at her mother, and she waited for her mother to say something, and she waited for her mother to protect her and tell the priest that he was wrong, and that Zara was her daughter, and she loved her, and she would never let anyone take her away. But Queen Seraphine did not say any of those things. Instead, the queen signed a paper with a golden pen, and her hand was shaking, and tears were falling down her cheeks, but she did not look at Zara, and she did not speak one word in her defense, and she let the guards come forward and take Zara by the arm. Zara screamed, and she cried, and she called for her mother over and over again. But her mother just stood there like a statue made of stone, and she watched as her only daughter was dragged out of the palace and put on a small ship and sent away to the outer moons where the forgotten people lived. That was the day Zara stopped being a princess and became nothing. The outer moons were cold and dark and ugly, and there was no golden light there, and no beautiful gardens, and no little glowing creatures to chase. And Zara had to learn very quickly how to survive in a place where nobody cared about her and nobody wanted to help her. She was placed in a shelter for abandoned children at first, and the other children there were mean to her because she looked different with her pale skin that glowed faintly in the dark, and her violet eyes that seemed to see right through people, and her silver blood that everyone said was cursed. The other children called her names and threw things at her, and told her she was a monster, and she should go back to where she came from, but she had nowhere to go back to, because her own people had thrown her away like garbage. Zara learned to fight back, and she learned to hide, and she learned to be quiet and invisible, and she learned that trusting people only led to pain, and she built walls around her heart that were higher and stronger than the walls of any palace. By the time she was 12 years old, she had run away from the shelter and was living on her own in the abandoned mining tunnels that ran beneath the surface of the moon, and she ate whatever she could find, and she wore clothes that she made from scraps, and she taught herself how to fix broken machines, because there was always work for someone who could repair things. Miners and scavengers who lived in those tunnels were rough people who had also been forgotten by the rest of the galaxy, and they did not ask questions about where she came from or why her blood was silver, and they paid her in food and supplies when she fixed their equipment, and that was enough for her. Years passed, and Zara grew from a scared little girl into a strong young woman, and she moved from moon and colony to colony, always staying just long enough to earn what she needed, and then moving on before anyone could get too close to her or learn too much about her past. She changed her name many times, and she wore thick cloaks to hide her glowing skin, and she told different stories about herself to different people, and after a while she almost forgot who she really was and where she really came from. Almost, but not quite, because every night when the twin sun set and the darkness came and she was alone in whatever small shelter she had found for herself, she would whisper the royal prayer that her nursemaid had taught her when she was very young, and she would remember The feeling of soft blankets and warm food and her mother singing to her before bed, and she would cry silently in the dark. Where no one could see her, she told herself that she did not miss Valorith, and she told herself that she did not miss her mother, and she told herself that she was better off alone and free than trapped in a palace where people hated her for something she could not control. But deep inside her heart, she knew that she was lying to herself. She was lonely and she was scared. And she was tired of running and hiding and pretending to be someone she was not, and she wanted more than anything to belong somewhere and to have someone who cared about her and who would never throw her away no matter what. But she had learned a long time ago that wanting things did not make them happen, and that the universe was not fair, and that some people were just born unlucky, and there was nothing they could do about it except keep going and try not to die. Oh, that is what Zara did for 15 long years. She kept going, and she survived, and she fixed machines, and she moved from place to place, and she watched the stars at night and wondered if anyone on Valorith ever thought about her, or if they had all forgotten that she ever existed. She was 22 years old when she finally settled a small dark moon at the edge of the known galaxy, and she found a cave that was dry and warm, and she made it into a home of sorts with a bed made of old blankets and a small stove for cooking and a workbench where she could repair things. It was not much, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe she could stay in one place and build something that lasted. She did not know that her life was about to change forever. She did not know that a ship was about to fall from the sky and crash into the rocky ground not far from her cave, and that inside that ship was a human being who would look at her and see something that no one else had ever seen. She did not know that everything she believed about herself and about the universe and about what it meant to be family was about to be turned upside down. All she knew on that quiet evening as she sat outside her cave and watched the stars was that she was alone, and she was tired, and she was ready for something different, even if she did not believe that something different would ever come. And then she saw the fire streaking across the sky, and she heard the terrible sound of metal screaming as it broke through the atmosphere, and she watched as the ship hit the ground and exploded into flames, and without thinking she grabbed her tools and ran toward the crash. Because even after everything she had been through, she could not just sit there and let someone die if there was any chance she could help them. That decision would change everything. Zara ran faster than she had ever run in her life, and her heart was pounding in her chest, and her lungs were burning, but she did not slow down, because she could see the flames getting bigger and bigger, and she knew that whoever was inside that ship did not have much time. When she reached the crash site, the heat was so strong that she had to cover her face with her cloak, and the smoke was thick and black, and it made her eyes water, but she pushed forward anyway because she could hear something coming from inside the broken ship, and it sounded like a voice calling for help. She found a gap in the twisted metal, and she squeezed through it, and she crawled on her hands and knees until she found him lying on the floor of what used to be the cockpit, and his face was covered in blood, and his leg was trapped under a heavy piece of equipment, but he was alive, and his eyes were open, and he was looking at her. He had strange skin that was only one color and not multiple colors, like her people, and his eyes were a shade of blue-green that reminded her of the shallow seas near the palace, where she used to swim when she was a child, and his hair was dark and messy, and there was something about his face that made her feel calm even though everything around them was on fire. She did not waste time with words, and she grabbed the heavy equipment, and she pulled with all her strength. And it took her 3 tries, but finally she managed to move it enough for him to slide his leg free, and then she grabbed him under the arms, and she dragged him out of the ship and across the rocky ground until they were far enough away from the flames to be safely passed out right after they got clear, and Zara sat there in the Dirt next to him, breathing hard and wondering what she was supposed to do now because she had never seen a human being before except in pictures and stories, and she did not know if he needed special care or special food or if his body worked differently than hers. But she could not just leave him there to die. So she built a stretcher out of pieces from the wreckage, and she pulled him all the way back to her cave, and she laid him on her bed, and she cleaned his wounds, and she wrapped his leg in bandages, and she gave him water, and she sat next to him and waited. He did not wake up for 3 days. During those 3 days, Zara barely slept, and she watched him constantly, and she changed his bandages, and she dripped water into his mouth, and she talked to him even though he could not hear her because the silence was too loud, and she needed to fill it with something. She told him about the cave and about the moons and about the machines she fixed, and she told him about the stars and about the places she had been. And somewhere in the middle of the second night, when she was very tired and not thinking clearly, she told him about Valorith and about her mother and about the silver blood that had ruined her life. She had never told anyone those things before, and she did not know why she was telling them to a stranger who was unconscious and might not even survive. But it felt good to finally say the words out loud and let them go. In the morning of the 3rd day, he opened his eyes, and the first thing he said was thank you, and his voice was rough and weak, but it was the most beautiful sound Zara had ever heard because it meant he was going to live. His name was Marcus Chun, and he was from a planet called Earth, which was very far away on the other side of the galaxy. And he was a cartographer, which meant he made maps of space, and he had been traveling alone trying to chart some unexplored regions when his ship had a malfunction and crashed on this moon. He was curious about everything, and he asked Zara 100 questions about herself and about her people and about why she lived alone on this dark moon. And Zara was not used to people being interested in her, and at first she did not know how to respond. But Marcus was patient and kind, and he did not push her, and he did not judge her. And slowly over the days and weeks that followed, as she helped him recover, and they worked together to repair his ship, she found herself opening up to him in ways she had never opened up to anyone. She told him about being banished and about her silver blood and about how her own mother had signed the order to send her away. And she waited for him to look at her differently, the way everyone else did when they found out what she was. But he did not. Instead, he looked at her with those strange blue-green eyes, and he said that where he came from, family was not about blood, and it was not about genetics, and it was about who showed up, and who cared, and who stayed with you when things got hard. Zara did not know what to say to that because it was so different from everything she had been taught and everything she had experienced, and she felt something crack inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for a very long time was finally starting to open. Marcus was a terrible patient at first because he wanted to get up and move around and help with things, even though his leg was still healing, and Zara had to keep telling him to rest and stay still. And he would listen for a little while, but then he would get bored and try to hobble over to the workbench to see what she was doing. He asked her to teach him how to fix things, and she showed him the basics, and he was not very good at it, but he tried so hard, and he was so proud of himself when he finally managed to repair a small communication device, and his smile was so bright and genuine that Zara felt something warm bloom in her chest that she did not recognize. She realized later that it was happiness, and she had not felt it in so long that she had forgotten what it was like. They developed a routine, and every morning, Zara would go out to scavenge for parts and supplies, and every afternoon they would work together on repairing his ship, and every evening they would sit outside the cave and watch the stars and talk about their lives and their dreams and their fears. Marcus told her about Earth and about the blue sky and the green trees and the oceans that were so big you could not see the other side. And he told her about his family and about his mother, who made the best food in the world, and his father, who told terrible jokes, and his little sister, who was studying to be a doctor, Zara had never heard anyone talk about their family with so much love and warmth, and it made her sad and jealous and hopeful all at the same time, because it showed her that families like that existed somewhere, even if she had never had one. Marcus noticed when she got quiet, and he would change the subject and make her laugh with a silly story or a ridiculous question, and he never made her feel bad for her feelings, and he never told her to get over it or move on, and he just let her feel whatever she was feeling and sat with her through it. One night, when the stars were especially bright, Marcus looked at her and said that he was glad his ship had crashed on this moon, because if it had not crashed, he would never have met her, and meeting her was the best thing that had happened to him in a very long time. Zara did not know what to say, so she did not say anything, and she just sat there next to him and looked at the stars, and for the first time in 15 years she did not feel completely alone. The ship was almost repaired, and soon Marcus would have to leave and go back to his life and his maps and his family on Earth, and Zara would be alone again on this dark moon with nothing but her tools and her memories. She tried not to think about it, but it was always there in the back of her mind, and every day that passed brought them closer to goodbye, and she did not know how she was going to survive without him, because he had shown her what it felt like to be seen and cared for. And she did not want to go back to the way things were before. And then the distress signal came, and everything changed again. The signal came in the middle of the night, and it woke them both up with its loud beeping and its flashing red light. And at first, Zara thought there was something wrong with the ship they had been repairing, but then she realized the signal was coming from her old communication device, and it was broadcasting on a frequency she had not heard in 15 years. It was the royal frequency of Velorathi. Stood there frozen and unable to move, and her heart was beating so fast she thought it might explode out of her chest, and her hands were shaking and her mouth was dry, and she could not believe what she was hearing. Marcus came up behind her and put his hand on her shoulder and asked what was wrong, and she could not speak, so she just pointed at the device and let him listen. The message was from the Royal Council, and it said that a terrible plague had come to Velorath, and it was killing everyone with golden blood, and the nobles and the royal family and the priests were all dying, and the doctors could not find a cure. And they had searched through all the old genetic records, and they had discovered that silver blood might hold the key to stopping the disease. They were calling for Zara to come home. They were begging her to come home. The same people who had thrown her away like garbage 15 years ago were now asking her to save them, and Zara felt so many emotions at once that she did not know what to do with any of them, and she felt anger, and she felt sadness, and she felt fear, and somewhere deep down she felt a tiny spark of hope that she tried very hard to ignore. Marcus turned off the message and looked at her and waited for her to speak. Zara walked outside the cave and stood in the cold night air and looked up at the stars, and she thought about all the years she had spent running and hiding and surviving, and she thought about all the nights she had cried herself to sleep, and she thought about her mother standing in that great hall and signing the paper that sent her away. Why should she help them? Why should she go back to a place that had caused her so much pain? Why should she save people who had treated her like she was cursed and evil and worthless? She said these things out loud to Marcus, and her voice was shaking, and her eyes were filled with tears, and she expected him to agree with her and tell her that she did not owe them anything, and that she should let them suffer the way they had made her suffer. But he did not say that. Instead, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said that he understood why she was angry, and he said that she had every right to be angry, and he said that what they did to her was wrong and cruel and unforgivable. But then he asked her a question that she was not expecting. He asked her if refusing to help them would make her feel better, or if it would just turn her into the kind of person she did not want to be. Zara did not have an answer for that. Marcus continued, and he said that he had seen the kind of person she was, and he had seen how she ran toward a burning ship to save a stranger, and he had seen how she cared for him when he was hurt, and he had seen the kindness and the strength inside her that she tried so hard to hide. He said that the people who hurt her did not deserve her help, but maybe this was not about them, and maybe this was about her and who she wanted to be and what kind of life she wanted to live. Zara was crying now, and she could not stop. And Marcus pulled her into his arms and held her and let her cry. And he did not say anything else because he knew that she needed time to figure out what she wanted to do. They stayed like that for a long time under the stars. In the morning, Zara made her decision, and it was the hardest decision she had ever made, but she knew it was the right one because when she thought about those people dying, and she thought about the children who were probably scared and confused, and she thought about the families who were losing the people they loved, she could not just sit there and do nothing. She was not going back for the council, and she was not going back for the priests, and she was definitely not going back for her mother. She was going back for the innocent people who had never done anything to hurt her, and who did not deserve to die because of a disease. They could not control Marcus, listen to her explain her reasons, and then he did something that surprised her completely. Said that he was going with her. Zara told him that he did not have to do that, and she told him that Valorith was dangerous and the people there might not be kind to humans, and she told him that this was her problem and not his, and he should go back to Earth and be with his family. But Marcus shook his head and said that she was his family now, and he was not going to let her face this alone, and that was final, and there was no point in arguing about it. Zara had never had anyone say anything like that to her before, and she did not know how to respond, so she just nodded and turned away so he would not see the fresh tears on her face. They finished repairing the ship that same day, and by nightfall they were flying through space toward Valorith. And Zara sat in the co-pilot seat and watched the stars blur past the window and tried not to think about what was waiting for her. When they arrived at Valorith, Zara barely recognized it because the beautiful gleaming city that she remembered from her childhood was now dark and quiet, and there were no ships flying through the sky, and there were no people walking through the streets, and it looked like a ghost town. They landed in front of the palace, and the guards who met them were thin and sick and exhausted, and they looked at Zara with wide eyes because they recognized her face even after all these years, and they could not believe she had actually come. The council was waiting in the Great Hall, and there were only 3 of them left because the rest had died from the plague, and they looked small and scared and nothing like the powerful, intimidating figures that Zara remembered from her childhood. And then she saw her mother, Queen Seraphine, was sitting on her throne. But she did not look like a queen anymore, and she looked old and broken, and her golden crown was crooked on her head, and her beautiful robes were wrinkled and stained, and her eyes were red from crying. When the queen saw Zara, she stood up and her legs were shaking, and she walked slowly across the great hall, and she fell to her knees in front of her daughter, and she looked up at her with tears streaming down her face. "You came back," she whispered. Zara looked down at her mother, and she felt all the old anger and pain rising up inside her, but she also felt something else, and it was something she had not expected, and it was pity. She did not reach out to touch her mother, and she did not kneel down to comfort her, and she did not say that everything was forgiven, because it was not. Instead, she looked past her mother at the council, and at the sick guards, and at the empty palace, and she said that she did not come back for them, and she did not come back for the crown, and she did not come back because she missed her old life. She came back for the people outside these walls, and she came back for the ones who were suffering and dying, and who needed help, and she was going to do everything she could to save them. And then she turned and walked out of the great hall with Marcus beside her, and she did not look back. The medical center was filled with dying people, and the smell of sickness was everywhere, and the doctors and nurses were running from bed to bed trying to help, but there was nothing they could do because they had no cure, and all they could do was try to make people comfortable while they waited for the end. Zara walked through the rows of sick people, and she saw children lying in beds, too big for them, and she saw parents holding hands with their partners, and she saw old people who had lived long lives and young people who had barely begun to live, and all of them had the same look in their eyes, and it was the look of people who had given up hope. Marcus stayed close to her, and he did not say anything, but she could feel his presence beside her, and it gave her strength to keep going, even when she wanted to turn around and run away from all this suffering. The head scientist was a woman named Divala, and she was one of the few people with golden blood who had somehow survived the plague, and she looked exhausted and defeated. But when she saw Zara, her eyes lit up with a tiny spark of hope. She took Zara and Marcus to her laboratory, and she explained what they had discovered about the plague and about silver blood, and she showed them all the research and all the tests and all the failed experiments. And she said that they believed Zara's blood contained antibodies that could fight the disease, but they needed to do more tests to be sure. Zara rolled up her sleeve and told them to take whatever they needed. They took samples of her blood, and they ran tests all through the night, and Zara sat in the laboratory and watched them work, and Marcus sat beside her and held her hand, and they did not talk because there was nothing to say, and all they could do was wait and hope. In the morning, Dr. Vela came to them with good news and bad news. The good news was that Zara's blood did contain the cure, and they could create a treatment that would save everyone. The bad news was that the treatment required a full transfusion of Zara's blood, and the process would be dangerous and painful, and it would leave her weakened for months, and there was a chance she might not survive it at all. Zara sat very still and listened to Dr. Vela explain all the risks and all the possible complications, and she thought about everything she had been through and everything she had survived, and she thought about the people in the medical center who were dying right now while she was sitting here thinking about herself. She looked at Marcus, and she saw the fear in his eyes, and she knew that he did not want her to do this because he was afraid of losing her. But she also saw something else, and it was understanding because he knew her, and he knew what kind of person she was, and he knew what she was going to decide. Before she could say anything, the door opened, and the council members walked in, and they were followed by Queen Serafini, and they all looked at Zara with expressions that made her uncomfortable, because they were looking at her like she was something valuable and important, and not like she was a person. The council offered her a deal. They said that if she gave her blood and saved their people, they would restore her title and her wealth and her place in the royal family, and they would make a public announcement that she had never been cursed, and that the priests had been wrong, and they would give her everything she had lost when she was 7 years old. Zara listened to their offer, and she felt nothing. She had spent 15 years dreaming about this moment, and dreaming about being welcomed back, and being told that she was worthy, and being given back everything that was taken from her. But now that it was actually happening, she realized that she did not want any of it. She did not want to be a princess, and she did not want to live in a palace, and she did not want to be surrounded by people who only valued her because she could do something for them. She looked at Marcus, and he gave her a small nod, and his eyes said the same thing they always said, and it was whatever you choose, and I will support you. Zara stood up, and she looked at the council, and she looked at her mother, and she said that she did not want their title, and she did not want their money, and she did not want anything from them except the chance to help the people who were suffering. She said that she was not doing this for them, and she was not doing this to be rewarded, and she was doing this because it was the right thing to do, and because she could not live with herself if she walked away and let innocent people die when she had the power to save them. The council members looked shocked and confused because they could not understand why anyone would turn down such an offer, and they tried to argue with her and convince her to change her mind, but Zara was done listening to them. She rolled up her sleeve again, and she looked at Dr. Vila, and she said to take whatever they needed and to start the procedure as soon as possible. The transfusion took 12 hours, and it was the most painful thing Zara had ever experienced, and there were moments when she wanted to give up, and moments when she thought she was going to die, but every time she felt like she could not go on, she thought about the children in the medical center and the families who were waiting for a cure, and she found the strength to keep fighting. Marcus never left her side, and he held her hand through every moment of pain, and he talked to her and told her stories and reminded her of all the reasons she had to live. And when she cried, he wiped her tears, and when she screamed, he told her it was okay, and he was there, and she was not alone. After the procedure was finished, Zara fell into a deep sleep, and she did not wake up for 11 days. During those 11 days, Marcus sat beside her bed, and he read to her from books he found in the palace library, and he told her about Earth, and about the mountains and the oceans and the forests, and he described the blue sky in so much detail that she could almost see it in her dreams. He told her about all the things they were going to do together when she woke up, and all the places they were going to visit, and all the adventures they were going to have, and he made her promises that he intended to keep. Every single one of the doctors came and went, and they checked her vital signs, and they said that she was getting stronger, and that the procedure had been successful, and that the cure was working, and people were already starting to recover all over the city. On the 11th day, Zara opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was Marcus sleeping in a chair beside her bed with his head resting on the mattress, and his hand still holding hers, and she smiled. Even though it hurt to move her face, she squeezed his hand, and he woke up instantly. And when he saw that her eyes were open, he started to cry, and he told her that he had been so scared, and he thought he was going to lose her, and he did not know what he would do without her. Zara tried to speak, but her voice was weak and scratchy, so she just said his name, and it was enough, because it told him everything he needed to know. She was alive, and she was going to be okay, and they were going to have their future together. The weeks that followed were slow and quiet, and filled with small moments that meant more to Zara than any crown or title ever could. She was weak for a long time, and she could not walk without help, and she could not do the things she used to do. But Marcus was patient and kind, and he helped her with everything, and he never complained, and he never made her feel like she was a burden. They stayed in a small room in the palace, because Zara was too weak to travel, and even though she hated being there, she had no choice but to accept it for now, and Marcus tried to make the room feel more like home by bringing in flowers and books and little things that made her smile. The plague was over, and the people of Valorath were recovering. And everywhere Zara looked, she saw signs of life returning to the city, and she saw children playing in the streets again, and she saw families walking together and laughing, and she saw hope in people's eyes where there used to be only fear. They called her a hero, and they wanted to celebrate her and thank her. But Zara did not want any of that, and she asked Marcus to tell people that she needed rest and privacy, and she stayed in her room and watched the city heal from her window. One evening, there was a knock on her door, and when Marcus opened it, Queen Seraphine was standing there looking small and uncertain and nothing like the powerful queen that Zara remembered from her childhood. Marcus looked at Zara and asked if she wanted him to send her mother away, but Zara shook her head and said it was okay, and she told Marcus to let her in. The queen walked into the room slowly, and she stood in front of Zara, and she did not seem to know what to do with her hands, and her eyes were filled with so much sadness and regret that Zara almost felt sorry for her. Almost, but not quite. Seraphine said that she had come to apologize, and she said that what she did 15 years ago was the worst mistake of her life, and she said that she had been weak and scared, and she had let the council and the priests convince her that sending Zara away was the only way to protect the kingdom. She said that she had regretted it every single day, and she said that she had never stopped loving her daughter, and she said that she would do anything to make things right if Zara would give her a chance. Zara listened to her mother speak, and she felt all the old pain rising up inside her, and she wanted to scream and cry and tell her mother how much she had hurt her and how much she had suffered, and how many nights she had spent alone and afraid, and wondering why she was not good enough to be loved. But she did not do any of those things. Instead, she took a deep breath and she looked at her mother, and she said that she forgave her, not because what she did was okay, and not because the apology was enough, and not because Zara had forgotten all the pain and suffering she had been through. She forgave her because holding on to that anger was too heavy, and she was tired of carrying it around, and she wanted to be free of it so she could move on with her life. But she also told her mother that forgiveness did not mean things could go back to the way they were before, and it did not mean she wanted to stay in the palace and be a princess again, and it did not mean they would have a normal mother and daughter relationship too. Much had happened, and too much time had passed, and Zara was a different person now, and she had built a life for herself without her mother, and she was not willing to give that up. Seraphine nodded and tears were running down her face, but she did not argue or try to change Zara's mind, and she simply said that she understood and she was grateful that Zara was willing to forgive her at all. She asked if there was anything she could do for Zara, and Zara thought about it for a moment, and then she said yes. There was one thing. She asked her mother to let her go and to accept that she had chosen a different path, and to not try to guilt her into staying or make her feel bad for leaving. Seraphine promised that she would do that as she leaned down and kissed Zara on the forehead, and it was the first time they had touched in 15 years. And then she walked out of the room and closed the door behind her. Zara sat there for a long time after her mother left, and she did not cry, and she did not feel angry, and she just felt peaceful and light, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Marcus sat down next to her and asked if she was okay, and she told him that she was better than okay, and she was ready to leave this place and start their new life together. It took another few weeks for Zara to be strong enough to travel, but finally, the day came when she could walk on her own, and she could breathe without pain, and she was ready to go. They packed their few belongings into Marcus's repaired ship, and they said goodbye to Dr. Vela and the other doctors who had helped save her life, and they walked out of the palace for the last time. Queen Seraphine was standing on the steps watching them leave, and she looked sad, but she did not try to stop them, and she just raised her hand in a small wave, and Zara waved back, and then she turned and walked toward the ship without looking back. Marcus asked her where she wanted to go, and she smiled and said she wanted to see Earth, and she wanted to meet his family, and she wanted to see the blue sky and the green trees and the oceans that he had told her so much about. Marcus laughed and said that his family was going to love her, and he warned her that they were loud and nosy, and they asked too many questions, and they were probably going to try to feed her way too much food. Zara said that sounded perfect. They climbed into the ship, and Marcus started the engines, and they lifted off from Valorith and flew up through the atmosphere and into space, and Zara watched her old home get smaller and smaller until it was just a tiny dot among all the other stars. She did not feel sad, and she did not feel regret, as she just felt excited for what was coming. Next, Marcus reached over and took her hand, and he looked at her with those beautiful blue-green eyes, and he asked her if she was ready, and she said yes, and she meant it with her whole heart. They had a long journey ahead of them, and there would be challenges and difficulties and things they could not predict, but Zara was not afraid because she was not alone anymore, and she had someone who loved her and who chose her and who was going to stay with her no matter what. She had spent her whole life being told that family was about blood and genetics and royal titles, but Marcus had shown her that family was something else entirely. Family was about who showed up when you needed them, and who held your hand through the hard times, and who saw you for who you really were and loved you anyway. Family was about choice and not about obligation. And Zara had finally found her family. As the ship flew toward Earth and toward her new life, Zara leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder and closed her eyes, and she smiled, and for the first time in her entire life she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been banished and abandoned and forgotten, But she had also been found and loved and chosen, and that made all the difference in the universe.